David, welcome to another episode of our Friday series that begins here on YouTube and Periscope and DLive and of course Patreon and Subscribestar, all of the platforms that you and I utilize. And of course the show will continue at the top of the hour at 2 p.m. Eastern on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and also patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. These are the platforms that you and I have utilized to great success to share this very fascinating information that you and I are constantly examining. And it's amazing to me, David, the people who are trying to dissuade people from watching our reports. How are you today on this Friday?
I'm very well, Jason. Nice to be with you.
Lovely to see you as always, David. We're going to be talking today, of course, about the connections, the odd connections between Lockheed Martin, the horrendous death of Jonbenet Ramsey, and the attacks at the Pentagon. Now, there's a rather annoying individual who, of course, I was totally unaware of until he started inserting himself into our consciousness by harassing and constantly producing social media posts, including videos on YouTube, where he's promulgating false information, making blatantly false claims with no regard for the truth, and pushing these stories. You might call them fake news injects, right?
Oops. I mean,
it's a very festive ringtone, David.
Oops, sorry. This is. Oh God. Sorry. Just so I know, I don't know how to turn these modern technology things off.
No problem. But anyway, David, I really have grown quite tired of speaking of and dealing with this individual, but he insists on making himself the topic of conversation, which frankly, in and of itself, is part of his agenda. The only reason why we continue discussing him is because it does seem remarkable the lengths to which he's willing to go to convince people that the things that we're saying and the evidence that we're pointing out, the coincidences we keep asking questions about, he wants people to think are, not worth their attention. They're fake, they're false. He wants people instead to focus on imaginary corporations that are not corporations. You know, everyone knows that I've run a company and still own a company called 21st Century 3D. Of course, that's not a corporation. It's a business entity defined by the DBA. And so I don't want to get into answering their nonsense point by point because that's what they want us to do. But let's focus on the real facts of what we're here to discuss today, David. Can you please explain to us what this connection is between Lockheed Martin, the death of Jonbenet Ramsey, and the incidents that occurred on September 11th, 2001?
With pleasure, Jason, and of course with your wonderful collage, it makes it so much easier to talk to the image. So the woman at the front and center of this collage, her name is Marilyn Hewson. She joined Lockheed Martin in 1983. So she was obviously fast-tracked. She's now described as the most powerful woman in the world by virtue of being the chief executive officer and chairman of Lockheed Martin, which is, of course, is an enormous defense contractor. And my argument would be she can only be the most powerful woman in the world as the CEO of Lockheed Martin if President Donald Trump is not the most powerful man. Because at the stroke of a pen, Donald Trump could have Lockheed Martin investigated for two stand-down situations, one on Christmas Day of 1996 and the other on September the 11th, 2001 at the Pentagon. Just to make that clear, the established procedure, as I understand it, for a corporation such as Lockheed Martin, which has a key role in defense strategy for the United States of America, is that if there's any indication of a threat to a director or a member of that director's family, which appears to be coming from a foreign or potentially a terrorist source, then standard or security operating protocols or procedures are kicked in, which involve Lockheed Martin working very closely with the FBI. And for instance, in previous events, I don't know whether it was Lockheed Martin, where there was a threat to a director of a major defense contractor, literally hundreds of FBI agents descend on the scene where the source of the threat is, and the local police are pushed to the boundary or the perimeter to control anyone who's entering or leaving and make sure no evidence is removed.
Now, David, may I ask you, just for the people among us who are skeptical, as they should be, how can we confirm that this is a procedure of Lockheed Martin? Is there a web page that Lockheed Martin describes this security protocol? Do we have a news article that describes this security protocol? Because people deserve to question anything and everything that we say, that CNN says, that the New York Times says. I do like to back these things up with the best evidence that we're able to find. And certainly you and I, as co-hosts of a talk show here on YouTube and other social media platforms, are free to explore these elements of evidence, speculate as to how they might be connected in the pursuit of answers to questions that should be troubling to people, like how can a 6-year-old girl be brutally murdered in her own home? And even amid such copious evidence, the crime remains unresolved, unsolved, a cold case to this day.
And the public is pointed at obviously innocent candidates or suspects, such as the little girl's brother, who's supposedly presumed to have written a 3-page ransom note with very long words. And I don't know how smart you were at 9 or 10 years old, but a lot of those words would be way above my head. I think I had a pretty good vocabulary. But by the by, yes, you asked for a reference. If you Google disgruntled Lockheed Martin VP, right, there's a pretty good description. And again, you can always say, well, is it true or is it not? But there's a level of detail there that suggests that whoever wrote this up had done their homework. And this is where you find this term SOP for a threat to an executive in a major company. I think it's security operating procedures or standard operating procedures, where the FBI and the Lockheed Martin people get together to take control of the crime scene.
Now, do I have the right result here, David? Because sometimes it's difficult to find exactly the correct.
Disgruntled Lockheed Martin. Yes, okay. Disgruntled Martin, second down.
This one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So if you open that up, whoops, why doesn't that do what I do? There's a whole text of, if you click on disgruntled Martin, you know, the hot link there you go.
Okay.
Right, so I won't go into the details there, but let's assume that every one of the listeners can look into that, make their own judgment. There's incriminating evidence and exculpatory evidence. I think the exculpatory evidence is very weak. I think this looks very strong, that there were senior people in Lockheed Martin who knew who and why there was a stand down on Christmas Day of 1996, and the standard or security operating procedures were not followed, so the site was not flooded by FBI.
But David, forgive me. Isn't this just a blog post? Could be from anyone. How do we know that these are the actual?
Of course, right. So, but you know, one has to go down this. We do know that the FBI didn't show up.
Yes.
Right. Now, why didn't they show up? We also know that the Lockheed Martin standard procedures was not followed because there was no one at a senior level in Lockheed Martin that addressed this threat. You know, the kidnap message had, "We represent a small foreign faction." Right? And the ransom note was found on the stairs, at the bottom of the stairs, by Patsy Cline.
Patsy Ramsey.
Sorry.
Patsy Cline's a singer.
Yeah. All right. So it appears the standard procedure. So let me jump to the Pentagon. As you see, if you go back to your collage, right, what I'm trying to do is not get bogged down in the detail of who done it at either crime scene or what done it, but so much as the fact that the standard procedures when an attack on this scale is not followed, right? So it's a cover-up that provides us more information about, I think, the conspirators than the actual events themselves. So over on the right, you see, you have the Amalgam Virgo war game, sort of the front page of the briefing document, and this is dated 1st and 2nd of June of 2001.
Yes.
Right? Now, I suppose you could ask, is that bogus? Well, you could ask that question about everything, but there is no contradiction anywhere that I can find to the fact that there was an exercise on the 1st and 2nd of June 2001 that involved the picture or likeness or virtual identity of Osama bin Laden as the sort of the red team leader, and it involved a simulation of an attack on the United States of America by various missile devices. And
Yes.
if you go deeper into that document, the target was the Capitol building.
And I would add that this document has been discussed in open testimony in Congress, so if it were fake or fraudulent in some way, I think we would have a reasonable expectation that someone during that congressional hearing would have challenged this, and the fact that it wasn't is strong evidence that this is, in fact, a legitimate document and an exercise that took place.
Right. Now, an exercise on that scale, which I think included the simulated hijacking of a plane over Alaska, flying south through or over Abbotsford in British Columbia, near where I live, and then turning east and aiming at the Capitol building, together with all of the interlocking devices on the integrated systems and schematics, suggests that this was a exercise on the scale traditionally organized by an outfit called Booz, Allen and Hamilton. And you might describe it, or they might describe it, as a top-off exercise or top officials, where the theory is you want to engage your top officials and make sure that they're responding adequately in a timely fashion to a threat as it develops. Now, Mr. Swigart, apparently in 1992, as part of his perennial boastings about what he does and what he doesn't do and what we don't know, right, claims, I believe, that he was a specialist in classified networks in 1992 for Booz Allen and Hamilton. So Booz Allen and Hamilton works with companies like the 4 defense contractors you've got on your collage to put on a convincing scenario of an attack and then test the response of the defense team.
Resilience testing.
Sorry?
Resilience testing, is that?
Yes, resilience testing. So now let's jump from Lockheed Martin to who its important partners are. And let me go back to Marilyn Hewson just for a moment.
Sure.
Marilyn Hewson may think or may be thought of as the most powerful woman in the world, but she's entirely at the gift or benefit or discretion of the major shareholders in Lockheed Martin. And there are 3 major shareholders that should be of great interest to, I think, citizens, the public in the United States, because that's State Street, the banking and global custodian. There's the Capital Group and the Vanguard Group, and between those 3, they have let's see, about $28.65 billion worth of shares and 31.26% of the voting equity of the shares. Now, guess what, Jason? Those 3 shareholders were on the 47th floor, or representatives of the 47th floor of the North Tower, at a meeting of Serco shareholders, because they are Serco shareholders. So those 3 outfits have a huge volume and control, effectively de facto control of Lockheed. And if they decided that Marilyn Hewson, they didn't want her to be the most powerful person in the world, then they can just boot her out. They could vote anyone off because they control the board of Lockheed Martin. So I think many people often forget that a manager in Lockheed Martin doesn't control anything. He or she controls the people beneath them. They report to members of the board, generally the chief executive officer, in this case Marilyn Hewson, and of course the chief executive officer reports to the main shareholders, who have the ability to remove her or promote her or whatever it is. Now, in the case of Jonbenet Ramsey's father, he was John Bennett Ramsey. He was the chief executive officer of Access Graphics, which I believe was working on secure technologies at the Pentagon during the Pentagon renovation project. And of course, there was a bonus, which maybe Marilyn Hewson knows about, because on the ransom letter, it asked for $118,000. Which is
David, let's spend a little time talking about this ransom note, because it is rich with clues. And as you've said before, leaving such a detailed ransom note, rather than just doing whatever it is the criminal intended to do and leaving, it's just an unbelievable amount of evidence. Have we ever read through this fully on air, and should we do that?
Well, okay. Yes. Why don't you go ahead and just read it so that listeners can understand it?
And it's written. Listen, Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. Now that right away should trigger a response from the FBI. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. So they're talking directly about his company, a wholly owned subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. At this time...
So not the country. That is, they don't respect the United States of America.
Right.
Right. So this is a statement at a strategic level. It's not just Jonbenet, we want your money.
Right.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed. And if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter. You will withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. Make sure that you bring an adequate sized attaché to the bank. When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an earlier delivery of the money. And hence, it's hard to read that, David.
An earlier pickup.
Pickup of your daughter. There we go. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. Boy, that's odd. The two gentlemen watching over your daughter what's inserted there? Do not particularly like you, so I advise you not to provoke them. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. If we, what does it say? Catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices, and if any are found, she dies. You can try to deceive us, but be worried that we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. You stand a 99% chance of killing your daughter if you try to outsmart us. Follow our instructions, and you stand a 100% chance of getting her back. You and your family are under constant scrutiny, and as well as the authorities. Don't try to grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. Don't underestimate us, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. It is up to you now, John. Victory, SBTC. David, what's your interpretation of the contents of this lengthy ransom note?
Well, it's clue rich, and I have coined that riff on the second law of thermodynamics, which is that, well, the second law of thermodynamics in one expression is energy is neither lost nor gained in a process. My riff is evidence is neither lost nor gained in a process, but some evidence is wasted. And I believe this should be to the eternal shame of anyone working in the media that has focused or looked at this crime, because there's huge amounts of evidence that is being wasted, right? Even the psychological evidence. What kind of victory is it for an organization, whoever they are, to put that at the end of the ransom note, which is asking for money, when the little girl has been tasered, garroted, her skull has been fractured, and she may very well have been penetrated with the handle of the paintbrush or whatever it was that was used, the other side was used as part of the garrote. So this is a disgusting and brutal murder. And I just want to go back up the food chain of the kinds of people who might be persuaded to visit that kind of indignity or gratuitous cruelty on a little girl. Presumably it's the same kind of people who hanged the Shermans, husband and wife,
yes,
with belts,
extreme brutality,
of the swimming pool, where their legs were on the inside, away from the swimming pool, so they would have died slowly, choking side by side. And
torture.
Again, the purpose of that, let me, if I can quote from memory, I think it was Trotsky, he said, terror as a measure of the strength of will of the proletariat is historically justified because the proletariat was able thereby to break the political will of the intelligentsia and pacify the common man so that they support our agenda, in various organizations and disciplines. What other kinds of brutal murders are there? Well, how about the women out at the pig farm in British Columbia, right, where probably 60 women were abducted, First Nations, prostitutes, that's incidental, that made them easily vulnerable to be picked up, taken out from the downtown east side, taken out to the pig farm, and killed slowly, I believe, and methodically, in front of an audience of 1,700 to 2,000 people, some of whom I think were flown in by that pilot,
Russell Williams.
Russell Williams. Who else has been murdered in a very bizarre kind of way with total cruelty? Well, Gareth Williams, the GCHQ spy who had seconded to MI6, I think it was, who had hacked into the agenda of one Bill Clinton, right? Presumably finding out about this scuzzbag's trips to Little St. John's Island, courtesy of Jeffrey Epstein. So what I think the commonality in the cover-up here is, in each case, to emphasize the point that they're trying to make, they are ready to visit the most cruel indignities on the bodies of this people. Poor Gareth Williams was folded 3 ways and put in a sports bag, naked, probably with sodium perborate on his body to increase the rate of decomposition, padlocked from the outside, placed in a bath in Pimlico, in his flat, with the heating turned up. So when they did discover him, these useless words fail me, right? 2 weeks after, this is a high-grade spy and cryptographer, the kind of person who could hack into Mr. Sweigart's hack, and Mr. Zweigart wouldn't even know he'd been hacked. Right? Because he's too busy looking at people like you or talking about what we don't know.
Right.
So I think it's extremely important to understand there has to be a network that can deploy what I call the torture teachers. That is, people who have some kind of custodial role over students or young people that can select those victims and select the kind of people who will do this kind of murder. And as you know, I don't know if you want to take us back to the ransom note or just carry on in that direction about who these people are that might visit that kind of torture on individuals.
Well, whichever you like, David.
Okay, well, let's say that the people who wrote this, first of all, obviously there's at least 3 people, if we assume the writer. So someone is writing the note apparently on the stairs at the bottom of the
Well, they could have lied about that, couldn't they?
Of course, they could lie about anything, and all we can do is take the preponderance of evidence, put together a convincing theory, and ground test it, right? So we do know when the ransom note writer said that she'll be beheaded, she's got a crack in her skull all the way around, right? So someone was ready to execute whatever the threat was. I mean, that's a truth test, right? If you see my point.
Well, I do. The thing I'd like to add, David, is that we've had some of our regular viewers contest the speculation, the allegations, the findings, saying that DNA had somehow proven that it was the Ramseys. Now, I haven't had an opportunity to run that down, but I did find this article that suggests that the DNA is in doubt And a new analysis as of 2016 challenges the district attorney's exoneration of the Ramseys. So I'm not fully aware of all the DNA tests, but shall I read a bit of this to you?
Well, and the coroner, I believe, in Boulder, Colorado, has written a note of apology to the Ramseys. Well, Patsy Ramsey, she's passed away from cancer. But again, and I'm perfectly sympathetic with listeners who can pick out a particular element that may not be proven. My argument is that what we're trying to do, I believe, is that demonstrate there are certain technologies or patented technologies where the custody of these devices allows us to make an argument there is a wrongful death here, right? I think now that they've manipulated the justice system, through organizations like DOJ Pride in the States, where you're never going to be able to prove an insider guilty of murder one in a case like this, right? So there's only one remedy, I think, for the public at large, to look at these kind of incidents in terms of wrongful deaths, and then get discovery, and which is what I've got on the screen, David Hawkins Discovery CSI. I think that's what you and I do on a regular basis, but we're not. It's not aiming at a criminal court, right? It's like the OJ situation, right? So let me come back to the technology. We have Lockheed Martin. 4 months after the murder, the torture killing of Jonbenet Ramsey, is granted or makes an application for a patent for time division multiplex patent, which actually allows you to send bits and bytes through a pattern time signal known only to the sender and the receiver. It's a very elaborate system, and of course I'm not an expert in it. Maybe Mr. Swigert would like to come on the show and explain how this isn't a very, very powerful encryption system. Now, what it will allow you to do is to hack into, let's say, networks such as the Federal Bridge Certification Authority and launch a hoax, a fake story, a media play into the Federal Bridge, which is ultimately transmitted to its members. Well, on the Federal Bridge, you have, as we know, a little cluster of organizations that I think have been deeply or extremely vulnerable to being hacked, and that is the state of Illinois, Veterans Affairs, and what is the third one? Veterans Affairs, State of Illinois, and Department of Justice.
Right.
Right. So if you zoom in, or either on your collage or what, you can see State of Illinois, Department of Justice, or Veterans Affairs. So what I'm saying is with the murder of little Jonbenet Ramsey and the attack on the Pentagon, it would have been very possible for a skilled hacker, whether ethical or unethical, to hack into that standard operating procedures where the FBI would normally be notified by a senior Lockheed director. They would deploy to the crime scene. The FBI would take control of the investigation of the crime scene, and the Boulder police would be confined to the periphery of the crime scene to make sure no one can come in or out. Well, that was totally ignored in the case of little Jonbenet Ramsey, and again at the Pentagon. Because if we flip to the Pentagon, for example, we see Mr. Swigert in that hole. It's a little schematic, right? But the hole is not a characteristic, and I'm a mechanical engineer, but I don't need to know the details. A Boeing aluminium-hulled aircraft with plastic and bodies and a couple of titanium engines cannot punch a hole through 8 reinforced walls of the Pentagon and create a 12-foot diameter hole on the inside courtyard with 1.5 tons of debris on the inside.
I think we all agree, David, that something other than a jumbo jet hit the Pentagon and caused this damage. I've actually been contacted by one of our regular viewers who's an experienced firefighter who wants to join us on a future broadcast to talk about the fire science of what went on in the Pentagon, and he's got experience in urban search and rescue. So we certainly welcome the input of experts in the field. It's curious how some of those experts seem focused on dissuading people from watching our broadcasts and participating in the crowdsource. Oh, David?
Yes, I'm here.
Something odd just happened. Every screen went black for a moment. Okay, that's weird. Anyway, there are certain people who want to dissuade members of the crowdsource community from watching us and supporting the shows that you and I do here on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. These are valid questions that should be asked. I think many people are dissatisfied with the responses provided by the mainstream news, not only in the case of JonBenet Ramsey's murder, but of course also in the case of 9/11. And I don't understand why these experts would challenge us in the way that they have. Certainly asking us for verification of this information is a good and healthy skepticism for anyone to have, but trying to counter the things we say with false statements and obvious lies, that causes me to ask, why would those people do that?
Well, I think it's very obvious that those two networks that have been joined through the state of Illinois. So you have the two networks. We have the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, where the root authority, incidentally, is the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. So I shake my head with possibly Entrust, which is a kind of area where Mr. Swigart has been working. They all seem to have splashed around these root keys or root authorities. And my understanding is if you have the root key to the network, you control the network. But I digress. The other network that I believe is almost more powerful from the cover-up point of view and the leak of media plays and news injects into the BBC is Northwestern University's IT partnerships, which I think you looked at the other day. Now, this is an extraordinary network, for example, because it takes organizations in the academic community, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago, and Northwestern University, and hooks them up to universities around the world, including in China and Russia.
And government agencies.
And government agencies. So my point is, which network in the mind of Mr. Swigart or the mind of Marilyn Hewson are vulnerable to hacks on Christmas Day of 1996 or September the 11th of 2001? Because if you've got the same group of hackers on both networks, maybe that explains why in both cases the FBI and the Lockheed Martin people were stood down. Now, at the Pentagon, what you have that fits in that hole, I think, is the rocket-boosted hardened penetrator bomb. That was a patent taken out by Lockheed Martin. And this is an interesting device because you have the rocket motor surrounded in its annulus with rocket fuel, and it can be accelerated with, let's say, at a proximity fuse. So just as the weapons platform approached or actually contacted the Pentagon on 9/11, that rocket-boosted penetrator bomb could be fired, and that would be the kind of thing that would punch a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon right through to the inner courtyard.
And certainly the Pentagon is considered a hard target.
Well, it should be, right? It should be the best guard target in the world. So now, what is the FBI doing? Confiscating all of the video images on what should be perhaps one of the best surveilled buildings in the world and taking them away. And the only information in their wisdom they've released to the public are 4 frames or 5 frames from a video camera outside the Pentagon.
David, let me just take you back for a moment because you move at a speed that is difficult for the average viewer to keep up with. And again, for people who claim that we're presenting speculation based on I don't know what, I want to point out that, you know, this web page that you're talking about, the one that describes the Northwest University IT partnerships, this is hosted by northwestern.edu. This is their information. So if they are to be trusted, they're telling us that they have an IT partnership. Now, we don't fully understand the nature of that, but with all of these groups, including Nortel, right? Then we want to talk about how Nortel spun off Entrust in a $114 million merger deal back in 2009. And isn't it correct, David, that Nortel is no longer in business and that they've been dissolved?
Yeah, it was the subject of a short-selling scam by some very powerful investors, and the shares went up to $120.
So let me ask you this. Sorry. Are we to believe that the Information Technology Department of Northwestern University has simply allowed the website here to, I mean, they haven't updated this information since 2009. I mean, they've got Nortel here. Nortel is quite obviously linked to Entrust. Entrust, of course, is on the Federal Bridge Certification Authority as a non-federal intermediary with root access. David Swigert has various resumes around the internet that tell us that he's worked for Entrust, and he's remarkably agitated by our investigation into these connections. Now, there's plenty about information technology and crime scene investigation and facts and details related to military operations and government operations that I am completely ignorant of, but I'm just observing these facts and the responses from Mr. Swigert, and I find them interesting.
Well, he should do, because you see, it's a CYA situation. I think he's hacked into these networks, and suddenly he's doubting himself that maybe he's not the greatest hacker in the world. There are people who have hacked in behind him and basically exposed him to some kind of liability, because he could have de facto custody of, let's say, the bit spreading device, and left a back door into it that allowed the Jonbenet Ramsey murder to stay a cold case, and similarly with the Pentagon. But let me just back up to that Nortel outfit. So Nortel Government Solutions got a contract with the Department of Justice, right? Which, as we know, is on the Federal Bridge, right? It's a neighbor of the state of Illinois, and the state of Illinois is on Northwestern University's IT partnerships. So the state of Illinois, or Northwestern University, would be a great place to hack into both networks prior to, the murder of Jonbenet Ramsey or the attack on the Pentagon, which killed Captain Gerald DeConto. So Nortel provided this very interesting contract to the Department of Justice called JABS, Joint Automated Booking System, which actually would allow you to book, let's say, psychopathic killers, right, together with the marshals and the guards, into a crime scene on Con Air, for example, and then fly them out again so that they're back in jail for breakfast. It's an extraordinary technology. So Nortel Networks, Government Solutions, provided JABS to the Department of Justice, and there were 3 awards on October the 22nd of 1996, 2 months before the little girl was tortured to death, in the Great Hall of Justice. I mean, what a joke, right? And they're handing out awards to, I know one person who got the award, and that's Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister. And she got an award, the Gore Hammer Award, for JPATS, the joint, the Department of Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, nicknamed Con Air, right? And another
David,
party
I'm sorry, how do we know that she received that award? Where do we get that information from?
She was in charge of Con Air, right? And so the 3
but
department
how do we know
heads,
that? How do we know that she got that award? Here's govinfolibrary.edu that's talking about the Gore Hammer Awards. Does this tell us about?
Right, that's the one. So Janet Reno, the rather androgynous creature who ran the Department of Justice for the Clinton regime, and I believe her subordinate, Jamie Gorelick, was there. And there were 3 department heads who were awarded the Gore Hammer for 3 particular projects for reinventing government. Now, how many Americans know that the Department of Justice was awarding these prizes for reinventing government? And how many Americans know or believe that their government needed reinventing? Well, one of the awards went to JPATS, which when Christine Marcy was senior counsel for the detention and deportation program of the Department of Immigration. Another award went to JABS, and with JABS you can book killers and their guards and anyone else who is interested into a crime scene before the crime occurs, execute the crime, provided you have the appropriate encryption technology, undetected by people like the Lockheed security people or the FBI. So that bit spread patent that was granted to Lockheed Martin is absolutely vital if you want to make sure that the crime scene is sufficiently discombobulated that you can't find out who done it. Now, what happened to that bit spread patent? In June of 2001, Lockheed Martin, I believe, was extorted into giving up that patent and transferring it to British Aerospace prior to the 9/11 attack. So what you did in the United States with your famous intelligence agencies, I believe there are 18 of them, serviced by Serco, is you handed off the timing of the protocols for the 9/11 attack to this British company, which is closely involved with Serco and the UK Ministry of Defence. Right?
David, I'm sorry. Let me just pause you here because this is important. I want to make sure that we can get some sort of confirmation that Christine Marcy received this Gore Hammer Award, because when I search for it, I see a lot of articles created by Field McConnell, who's someone who has now been very active in spreading fake news about me. So I want to make sure we have something to back up this research beyond just what Field McConnell has said and people who listen to Able Danger have spread. When I put in Christine Marcy Gore Hammer, I'm not really getting any satisfying results. How do we confirm this?
No, so you won't get, because they didn't name the individual heads of the department for which those projects, but the head of the department that had introduced JPATS is Christine Marcy, and she introduced it in 1984. So in that description of the Gore Hammer Awards, dated October 22nd, it goes to the project, not to the head of the department. But okay. JPATS was created, run, and operated by Christine Marcy.
So this is from justice.gov, 1996. Yes. Attorney General presents Hammer Awards at DOJ Lab Day. So this is something released by the United States Department of Justice in 1996. And it's Justice Prisoner Alien Transportation System, JPATS, which combines the resources of several DOJ components to schedule and transport prisoners more quickly, safely, and economically. And, you know, before we get into too many more details on that, David, I should remind people we're almost out of time here on YouTube for today, and we're going to continue the conversation on Patreon. So people should join us at 2 p.m. Eastern if you're not already sponsoring David or Crowdsource the Truth on Patreon. I hope that people will go now or just after we finish. There'll be a 15-minute break in between this show and the conversation on patreon.com/reverse CSI Storyboards, which is always simulcast on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. So sorry, David, what did you want to say before we transition over about JPATS?
At that meeting, October the 22nd, the basic elements of the projects, that is JABS, Joint Automated Booking System, and JPATS, which is Con Air, were in place 2 months before the murder of little Jonbenet Ramsey, which would have allowed someone to fly in a small foreign faction into Boulder, Colorado, get out of the plane, right, drive around to the home of Jonbenet Ramsey with an internal communication system hacked into Lockheed Martin, right, and the FBI, that allowed them to monitor the reaction and stand down Lockheed Martin and FBI during the Christmas Day killing of Jonbenet Ramsey, which was identical in terms of technology. So the technology used to stand down Lockheed Martin's security and screening places and allow a missile to be converted from a simulation mode during a continuity of government exercise to a live fire event which killed Captain Gerald DeConto and 125 of his colleagues in the Pentagon Navy Command Center. So Mr. Swigart and anyone else who's hacked into that, or even risks or is seen to have hacked into that network, should understand that I'm not saying we're coming for them physically, but justice is coming for them, because I want Marilyn Hewson, right, to appear on your show. I mean, it's an invitation, and she can explain what she knows about it, because by 1980 through 90, she'd had 13 years experience with Lockheed Martin.
Well, certainly it's our show, David, so hopefully she will appear here. I generally think someone like Marilyn Hewson probably would rather talk about space then come on our show. But we'll open that invitation to her. I mean, it's certainly interesting. There are obviously connections between the Jonbenet Ramsey murder and Lockheed Martin, and we're going to get into some of those more curious connections when we begin on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource-the-truth just 15 minutes from now. David, thank you so much for this breakdown today, and I'll be back with you in just a few minutes where I hope that many more people will join our generous Patreon sponsors. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jason.